Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the Appalachian family too evil for history books that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The screaming stopped at dawn, but the dogs, with a primal instinct, kept howling their mournful dirges until noon. Their cries were a deep, resonant keening, a sound of profound loss that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. In the remote, fog-choked hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the morning mist clung to the ridges like smoke from dying funeral pyres, the Weatherstone family had perfected a dark art, the art of making people disappear, not just from sight, but from memory, without anyone daring to ask a single question. This is not a mountain folk tale. This is a documented account of how an entire community, bound by fear and a terrible gratitude, chose a pact of collective silence over justice for nearly 3 decades. The year was 1892. While the world hurtled toward a new century, in places like Black Bear Hollow, time itself seemed to curdle and slow, trapped in an older, brutal rhythm. The first curious outsider of record, a surveyor named Alistair Finch, made the fatal mistake of following Possum Creek too deep into the hollow's embrace. His final journal entry noted the unusual number of chimneys on a single, sprawling cabin below. That season, the creek's water ran a strange, unsettling shade of rust. It carried the metallic tang of iron, but also something else. Something organic and sickly sweet. A scent the old-timers, their faces etched with a wisdom born of terror, would never name. An unspeakable horror had taken root here, a palpable presence. It was in every gust of wind that rattled the shutters and etched permanently, like a scar, deep in the eyes of the local people. You could see it in the way a mother would hastily pull her child indoors at the sight of a stranger, her hand making a subtle sign to ward off evil. You could feel it in the sudden, stony silence that would fall over the general store if the name Weatherstone was uttered above a whisper. What unspeakable evil could be so powerful as to force an entire community into a pact of silence, and what was truly burning, day and night, in the ever-smoking chimneys of the Weatherstone home, emitting a scent that was both hauntingly familiar as wood smoke and grotesquely, fundamentally wrong. To comprehend this ecosystem of horror, one must understand the land that nurtured it. Black Bear Hollow was more than a location. It was a natural trap, a forgotten world. The geography itself was an accomplice, a single, treacherous path, often washed out by rains, served as the only artery in and out. The dense, primeval forests swallowed sound whole, turning a desperate scream into a muffled cry. The hollow was a place easy to wander into, but terrifyingly difficult to leave. Local lore told of vanished Cherokee and a brutal family feud in the 1850s that left a clan unburied. The ground was already sour. In the late 19th century, this was a land where the laws of men were a distant rumor. Isolated communities lived by their own unwritten codes. A fierce and often brutal mountain justice. Isolation bred a deep-seated dependency, a reality where survival through a harsh winter depended entirely on the goodwill of your neighbor. This created the perfect fertile ground for an absolute power, a feudal lord in homespun cloth, to rise. In a world where your family's well-being depends on the man on the next ridge, you learn very quickly not to see what you shouldn't see and to forget what you shouldn't hear. And into this very crucible of isolation, sometime in the early 1870s, a wagon creaked its way up the path, carrying a family that would not just inhabit the hollow, but consume it. They were the Weatherstones. Josiah Weatherstone, the patriarch, was an embodiment of the land itself, tall, sharp-featured, and radiating a dangerous magnetic energy, with eyes the color of winter ice. He possessed a chilling combination of deadly charm and latent menace. He could disarm you with a folksy story, and in the next moment, a subtle hardening in his gaze would send a primal fear through your veins. He had an uncanny ability that made wise men step aside and foolish ones, drawn by his charisma, step fatally closer. But if Josiah was the visible tempest, his wife, Lavinia Applewhite, was the silent, deadly undertow eroding the community's soul. Where Josiah ruled through intimidation, Lavinia manipulated with strategic kindness and poisoned gifts. Her profound knowledge of herbal remedies was legendary, whispered among local women with a mixture of gratitude and dread. She could cure a child's fever or ease a difficult birth, but those who dared to cross her would find their luck suddenly run dry. A healthy cow would go barren, a promising crop would wither, and just as despair set in, Lavinia would appear at their doorstep, a sad smile on her face, offering a remedy or a basket of smoked meat, sealing to their loyalty with a kindness that felt more like a shackle. Their 12 children moved through the hollow like silent phantoms. They were not children in the normal sense. They did not play or laugh. They were quiet, watchful entities, their pale eyes all sharing their father's icy hue, ready to carry out their parents' orders without a flicker of emotion. Phineas, the eldest, had his father's height and chilling stillness. Minerva, the eldest daughter, possessed her mother's unnerving grace and a smile that never reached her eyes. They were a silent, ever-present army. The Weatherstone home itself, sitting ominously at the mouth of the hollow, seemed a living entity. It was a sprawling, chaotic structure of weathered logs, constantly being added to, looking like a malignant tumor gnawing its way up the mountainside. Smoke rose incessantly from its multiple chimneys, and the scent that drifted down carried the familiar notes of hickory and sage. But it was always underpinned by something else. A greasy, cloying sweetness that the local preacher refused to identify, choosing instead to speak vaguely of the temptations of the flesh. The first concrete sign of what was wrong did not come from screams, but from the quiet observations of a man of the law, according to the personal journal of Deputy Marshal Frank Toiver, dated October 15th, 1893. One detail from a routine visit had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter of bone. He described the oppressive hospitality, the fine china on the rough-hewn table, the unnerving silence of the children. But it was the smokehouse that truly chilled him. The detail he scrawled in his journal later that night was simple and devastating. Visited the Weatherstone place today. Something ain't right about their smokehouse. Too many bones for the amount of livestock they keep. That observation marked the beginning of a quiet, unspoken dread. But the inciting conflict arrived in the form of a man of God. In late September of 1892, a traveling preacher named Cyrus Pendleton rode into Black Bear Hollow. He was a man of earnest faith and naive optimism, seeing the community not as a den of secrets, but as a flock in need of a shepherd. His letters home were, at first, cheerful. He wrote glowingly of the Weatherstones, who had graciously offered him lodging, praising Josiah's knowledge and Lavinia's incredible cooking. But then, the tone of his letters began to shift. He mentioned the unsettling quietness of the children, describing them as watchful, like tamed animals that have not forgotten the wild. He wrote of an elderly woman who, with trembling hands, had pressed a charm into his palm and whispered, "Don't eat the meat they offer freely. Preacher, it comes at too high a cost." Cyrus dismissed it as superstition. His final letter was different. The cheerful tone was gone, replaced by urgent unease. He wrote of disturbing discoveries regarding local customs and promised to reveal everything in his next correspondence. That letter never came. The weekly correspondence stopped. It took another 5 months for church authorities to finally send 2 investigators to Black Bear Hollow. When they arrived, they were met with the full force of the Weatherstone charm. Josiah was somber and respectful, explaining with believable regret that the good preacher had simply decided the harsh mountain life was not for him and had departed for Lexington. Lavinia, dabbing at her eyes, showed them the preacher's room, his belongings still neatly stored. "We're keeping them safe for him," she said softly, to cap off the performance. She served them a memorable dinner, featuring what she claimed was the finest venison they would ever taste. The meat was tender, rich, and had an unusual, savory flavor they couldn't quite place. Lulled by the family's hospitality, the investigators left satisfied, praising the Weatherstones in their official report. And so, the pattern was set. The local sheriff, Abner Claiborne, a man who understood the unspoken rules, did nothing. The Weatherstones, in their grim way, kept the peace. In exchange, officials looked the other way. By 1894, the routine was grimly efficient. Strangers would arrive, the Weatherstones would offer hospitality, and within days or weeks, the visitors would supposedly continue their journeys, leaving behind belongings that Lavinia would add to her Hope collection items kept safe until their owners came back. They never did. The system was perfect, a machine of death disguised as mountain kindness. But it was about to face a challenge it had never anticipated: a man with legal authority who was immune to charm and unwilling to look the other way. The gears of justice, however slow, were beginning to turn. The quiet dread that had begun to fester within Black Bear Hollow was no longer a matter of local superstition or hushed whispers between neighbors. It had found a voice, a name, and a methodical purpose in the meticulous records of Dr. Horatio Gainsborough, the physician, a man of science in a land governed by folklore, had noticed a disturbing pattern that defied coincidence. Over a 2-year period, his ledgers documented an unprecedented number of local residents treated for what he carefully classified as nervous disorders and chronic digestive ailments. The symptoms were always the same: trembling hands, night terrors, a deep-seated anxiety that hollowed out the eyes, and a persistent, gnawing discomfort in the gut. What was most alarming, as he cross-referenced his notes late one evening by the flickering light of an oil lamp, was the timeline. These symptoms invariably appeared, like a grim harvest, in the days and weeks following community gatherings, church suppers, barn raisings, holiday feasts, where the Weatherstone family had been the most generous contributors of food. His notes, discovered decades later, tucked away in a dusty medical chest, revealed a mind grappling with a conclusion too monstrous to fully commit to paper. He wrote of the unusual richness of the Weatherstones' preserved meats, the subtle, almost soporific effect of Lavinia's spiced ciders, and the unsettling way the community seemed to crave the very provisions that appeared to be making them ill. He was witnessing a slow, systemic poisoning, but whether it was of the body or the soul, he could not be certain. But to question the Weatherstones directly required a particular kind of courage, a defiance that seemed to evaporate like morning mist whenever they're cold. Calculating eyes turned your way. The few residents who had, in the early years, attempted to voice concerns publicly had suffered a string of unfortunate accidents. A barn roof collapsed during a windless night. A prize bull was found dead from a mysterious sickness. A property dispute, long dormant, was suddenly revived with damning new evidence that only resolved itself once the accuser agreed to hold their peace. The message was clear. Silence was not merely a choice. It was a currency for survival. But the carefully constructed world of blood and silence, so long contained within the hollow's geographic and psychological walls, was about to face an external pressure it could not control. As winter approached in 1894, a new and dangerous element entered the deadly equation. A circuit court judge named Thaddeus Ashbury, a man whose reputation for relentless integrity was known throughout the state, had been asking uncomfortable questions. His office in Pikeville had received a slow but steady trickle of correspondence from families in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, all inquiring about relatives who had last been seen entering the treacherous mountain territory near Black Bear Hollow. These were not drifters or outlaws. They were merchants, homesteaders, and men of God, and they had vanished without a trace. Judge Ashbury was an outsider, a man of paper and law, who believed that the world operated on a system of evidence and procedure. He did not understand the unwritten codes of the mountains, and he possessed none of the ingrained fear that paralyzed the local authorities. His official inquiries, backed by federal authority, were scheduled to begin the following spring. The news of his impending arrival rippled through the hollow not like a wave, but like a seismic tremor, unsettling the grim equilibrium that had held for 2 decades. The Weatherstones, for the first time, were not just facing whispers and suspicions. They were facing the full, unblinking gaze of the United States government. They were about to demonstrate just how far they would go to protect their empire. Judge Thaddeus Ashbury's horse refused to cross the creek that morning. The animal, usually placid, reared back, its eyes rolling white with terror, its breath misting in the crisp March air. Its primal instincts, it would turn out, were far sharper than its rider's legal mind. When powerful men start asking the right questions in the wrong places, they often discover that some communities have already chosen their answers long ago and have fortified them with a wall of silence. The morning air in Black Bear Hollow on March 7th, 1895, carried the mundane sounds of mountain life, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood, the acrid smell of lye soap boiling in great iron kettles, and the gritty texture of coal dust settling on every surface like a fine black snow. It was a perfect facsimile of civilization, a stage set for a deadly performance. Judge Ashbury had arrived accompanied by his court stenographer, a sharp, observant young woman named Eugenia Radcliffe, and a seasoned federal marshal, Gideon Fenmore, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard-won frontier experience. Their mission was straightforward: investigate the disappearances of 11 documented travelers. Ashbury, a man who believed in the power of preparation, had a leather satchel filled with detailed files on each missing person, faded photographs, letters filled with worried queries from loved ones, and sworn testimony from the last witnesses to see them alive. What he had not, and could not, prepare for was the suffocating, psychological weight of the collective silence that seemed to press down on the hollow like the heavy, humid air before a storm. The Weatherstone cabin had grown since the previous autumn. New additions, built of fresh, weeping pine, sprawled in all directions, connected by covered walkways that created a confusing, maze-like structure It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. Behind the main house, a series of outbuildings, a smokehouse, a root cellar. Several large storage sheds dotted the property like wooden mushrooms after a rain. An official report from the Federal Marshal Service for the Eastern Kentucky District, dated 1895, noted the stark numbers: population of Black Bear Hollow, 47 permanent residents. Missing persons reports filed in past 3 years, 11. Local law enforcement investigations opened 0. Before the visitors had even fully dismounted, Lavinia Applewhite emerged from the cabin. She moved with the fluid grace of a queen in her own domain, wearing a spotless white apron over a dark wool dress that seemed far too fine for mountain living. Her smile was a warm, welcoming beacon. But Eugenia Radcliffe would later write in her private journal that something in the woman's pale, placid eyes reminded her of winter ice over deep, black water. Josiah appeared moments later, flanked by his 2 eldest sons, Phineas and Amos. Both young men possessed their father's imposing height and their mother's unsettling stillness. They nodded respectfully to the judge, but kept their hands visible in their positions strategically placed near the cabin's corners. A subtle but unmistakable show of controlled force. Josiah's greeting was a masterpiece of mountain hospitality laced with subtle intimidation. He praised the judge's reputation, expressed profound gratitude for the official attention, and then, with practiced ease, began to dismantle Ashbury's case, one missing person at a time. The young couple seeking homestead land. They had found better opportunities in Tennessee. He was sure of it. The traveling merchant. He had complained that mountain trading wasn't profitable and had headed west. Each explanation was wrapped in just enough plausible detail to seem credible, supported by a piece of carefully preserved physical evidence. He pointed to Cyrus Pendleton's worn Bible, sitting on a shelf as if waiting for his return. He showed them the merchant's empty sample case in the root cellar, supposedly left behind to lighten his load. And Lavinia, with a gentle, sorrowful sigh, opened a large cedar chest she called her Hope Collection, a heartbreaking assortment of wedding rings, pocket watches, and personal letters, all kept safe, she claimed, until their owners came back for them. Marshal Fenmore, a veteran of countless frontier deceptions, recognized the performance for what it was, a meticulously rehearsed play. His trained eye catalogued the details that didn't align with the family's narrative. The sheer volume of personal effects left behind was unnatural. The soil around several of the outbuildings showed clear signs of recent digging, and the heavy, persistent smell of wood smoke seemed far too intense for simple cooking fires, carrying an undercurrent that reminded him of a tannery. His suspicions deepened as he observed the Weatherstone children. The younger ones watched the visitors with the unblinking, feral focus of wild animals, while the older boys moved through the compound with a silent, unnerving efficiency. It was their silence that was most unsettling, not the shy quiet of isolated mountain children, but the calculated, disciplined restraint of people who had been taught from birth that words were dangerous things. Eugenia Radcliffe's stenographic training had taught her to observe the world in minute detail. She noted the unusual wear patterns on the cabin's floorboards, suggesting frequent, heavy traffic through specific areas that were not common living spaces. The kitchen, she saw, was equipped with more large pots, cleavers, and cutting implements than any single family, no matter how large, could possibly need. But most disturbing was the root cellar. It smelled strongly of preserving herbs, sage, rosemary, and something else, pungent and sharp, but contained suspiciously little actual food. When Judge Ashbury, his patience wearing thin, requested to examine the property's outbuildings, the family's cooperative facade showed its first hairline cracks. Josiah's explanations became more elaborate and slightly circular. His sons moved infinitesimally closer. And Lavinia's smile acquired a sharp one, a brittle edge that cut through her mountain charm. The judge was welcome to look anywhere he pleased, they assured him. But some structures were simply unsafe due to their age, and others contained private family matters far too delicate for official scrutiny. The standoff lasted for the better part of the afternoon, a quiet battle of wills waged under the watchful eyes of the mountains. Ashbury possessed legal authority but faced the stark practical limitations of his situation. He was in a remote, hostile location where the nearest federal support was a 2-day ride away. The Weatherstones offered complete cooperation while subtly, expertly demonstrating that their cooperation came with boundaries that wise men did not cross. The compromise, when it came, satisfied no one. Ashbury agreed to limit his inspection to areas the family deemed safe, while the Weatherstones, in a show of goodwill, allowed him to examine a few selected outbuildings under their careful, unblinking supervision. What he found in one of those sheds would haunt his dreams for the remainder of his abbreviated life. In a storage shed behind the main house, a place that smelled of damp earth and old iron, hanging from heavy hooks designed for curing meat, were garments that could not possibly belong to any member of the Weatherstone family. There was a preacher's formal black coat, carefully cleaned but bearing dark, rust-colored stains around the collar that no amount of lye soap could ever wash out. There was a merchant's sturdy leather vest, a small, neat hole punched clean through the chest, and hanging at the very back, folded with an almost ceremonial care, was a young woman's wedding dress, its lace torn and its hem stiff with something dark and dried. When Ashbury, his voice tight with a cold fury, demanded an explanation, Josiah's response was chilling in its simplicity. "People sometimes leave things behind when they depart in haste," he said, his icy eyes meeting the judge's without a flicker of emotion. "We preserve everything. It's a courtesy." The judge felt a wave of cold nausea wash over him. He realized, in that sickening moment of clarity, that he was not looking at storage. He was looking at trophies. As evening began to bleed across the sky, casting long, menacing shadows across the hollow, the Weatherstones insisted, with an overwhelming, suffocating hospitality, that their guests stay for dinner and accept accommodation for the night. To refuse would have been an egregious insult to mountain courtesy, a direct challenge they could not afford to make. Judge Ashbury found himself trapped, not by force of arms, but by the very same social conventions that had silenced an entire community for years. That night's meal, he was beginning to understand with a cold, creeping dread, would be his last. The soup spoon trembled in Judge Ashbury's hand, a tiny tremor that betrayed the cold dread coiling in his stomach. He tasted something that should not exist in any civilized kitchen, a faint, bitter undertone beneath the rich stew, a chemical whisper that numbed the tip of his tongue. Across the table, the Weatherstone family watched, their faces masks of serene hospitality. They watched with the patient, unblinking attention of predators studying wounded prey, waiting for the poison to complete its silent work. When respected officials vanish without a trace, it is not because the wilderness is vast, but because someone is powerful enough to make their absence seem as natural and as final as the setting sun. The dining room was a testament to the family's bloody prosperity, occupying the cabin's newest addition. Its raw pine walls still wept sap, and its windows were strategically positioned to provide clear sight lines in all directions, turning the room into a tactical command center. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat, beeswax candles, and a sharp, medicinal scent that Lavinia claimed was her special blend of mountain seasonings. The fire in the great stone hearth threw dancing shadows across faces that revealed nothing and promised less. Eugenia Radcliffe sat stiffly across from Marshall Fenmore. Both maintained a rigid composure, their training fighting the growing primal unease constricting their chests. The meal was an elaborate, theatrical affair, far beyond anything expected in such remote surroundings. Served on fine china that belonged in city mansions. Lavinia moved between the kitchen and dining room with practiced, silent efficiency, assisted by her daughter, Minerva, whose pale hands never stopped moving as she arranged and rearranged the silver cutlery. The conversation, steered by Josiah, followed disarming patterns. He regaled his captive audience with local history, weaving carefully edited versions of old feuds that painted his clan as reluctant peacekeepers. His older sons, Phineas and Amos, contributed laconic details about hunting conditions, their voices flat and devoid of emotion, while the younger children maintained their unsettling, penetrating silence. In his final spidery diary entry, Judge Ashbury had noted, "The meat has an unusual flavor, Mrs. Weatherstone claims it's a special preparation method. I have requested the recipe for my wife." Marshall Fenmore's instincts were screaming warnings. The family's behavior was too coordinated, their hospitality too insistent, their explanations too perfect. When he attempted to excuse himself to check on their horses, Amos Weatherstone immediately volunteered to accompany him, citing recent troubles with mountain cats. The message was clear. Guests were not permitted to wander alone after dark. The evening's entertainment revealed the family's true nature through carefully orchestrated, menacing demonstrations. Phineas displayed his uncanny skill with throwing knives, embedding blades deep into a wooden target with mechanical precision, all while casually discussing techniques for field dressing large game. His younger brother demonstrated complex rope knots, ostensibly for livestock, though the configurations seemed far better suited for restraining human limbs. Lavinia's contribution was the most disturbing. She produced a large, leather-bound journal, claiming it contained old family recipes. She read selected passages aloud, her voice a calm monotone. Despite describing methods that sounded more like surgical procedures than cooking intricate instructions on bleeding, jointing, and using specific herbs to tenderize. Her daughter Minerva watched the guests' faces intently during these recitations, cataloging their reactions with a chilling scientific detachment. As the evening wore on, the visitors began to experience physiological symptoms that were not from the food alone. Judge Ashbury's vision blurred. Eugenia's hands began to tremble. Marshall Fenmore found his thoughts becoming sluggish and disconnected. The Weatherstones observed these developments with the quiet, professional interest of physicians monitoring an experiment. The turning point came from the youngest stepson, Philomeno, who made an innocent-seeming comment about previous visitors. He mentioned, with childish pride, specific details about their belongings, a silver locket a woman had worn, a tune a clockmaker used to whistle details he could not possibly have known unless those guests had never left the hollow. Death comes quietly here. The thought screamed through Fenmore's fogged mind. His training kicked in despite his impaired condition. He tried to signal his companions, but it was useless. The Weatherstones had performed this routine for years. Every gesture was anticipated, every escape route blocked by family members positioned with military precision. The marshal's hand moved with agonizing slowness toward his sidearm. Just as the paralytic herbs in Lavinia's seasoning reached their full potency, his fingers went numb. Across the table, Judge Ashbury slumped forward, his face hitting his plate with a dull thud. Eugenia managed a single strangled scream before her voice disappeared, along with her ability to move. Josiah Weatherstone's transformation from gracious host to efficient killer was seamless and absolute. The charm melted away, revealing something terrifyingly empty. Something not entirely human. His family shifted from dinner companions to surgical assistants with horrifying coordination. The unspoken confession began. The three officials, still conscious in their paralyzed prisons, watched as the family began their methodical process of inventory and evaluation. Belongings were sorted. Documents were examined for intelligence value before being consigned to the fireplace. And the bodies themselves were assessed for utility with the dispassionate professionalism of livestock evaluators. Lavinia's leather-bound journal was brought out again, not for entertainment, but for business. It was a ledger of death. Its pages contained detailed notes from previous acquisitions, cross-referenced by weight, age, and what she chillingly termed preparation requirements. The federal officials represented her most prestigious entries to date. The family's efficiency was a terrifying spectacle. Within 2 hours, all evidence of the visitor's presence had been systematically eliminated or repurposed. Horses were led to distant pastures. Official papers were reduced to ash. Personal effects were cleaned and stored in the Hope collection. And the dining room was restored to a pristine condition. By midnight, the cabin had returned to its placid facade of domesticity. The only sounds were the crackling of logs and, much later, the distant, muffled splash of something heavy being lowered into Possum Creek. The official investigation into the missing persons of Black Bear Hollow ended the moment the investigators themselves disappeared. But some secrets grow too large for even the deepest graves to contain. 3 days later, a search party found the officials' horses, miles downstream, still saddled but riderless. The mountains, it seemed, had swallowed 3 representatives of federal authority. But the true consumption had been done by the community itself. When communities choose blindness over justice, evil doesn't just survive, it flourishes, protected under the warm blanket of willful ignorance. The news spread through eastern Kentucky like smoke. Sheriff Abner Claiborne received the telegraph, his face pale, understanding he faced a crisis that could obliterate his career. Doctor. Gainsborough was the first to find the horses, and his report to the sheriff painted a disturbing picture of methodical interference. The saddlebags had been carefully searched, official documents missing but personal items untouched, preserving the illusion of a natural misfortune. As search parties combed the hollow, they encountered a masterpiece of coordinated deception. Every resident, from the blacksmith to the school teacher, provided the exact same story. Yes, the officials had arrived, conducted their business with the helpful Weatherstones, and departed northward. The consistency was too perfect, the recitation of a script rehearsed in the theater of fear. Clarissa Wentworth, the schoolteacher, had documented inconsistencies in her private journal, but the community had made its position clear. Parents began questioning her methods, and the school board discussed budget cuts. The message was delivered without words, ask no questions. The linchpin of this conspiracy of silence was Verity Blackthorne, the general store operator. Her ledgers contained records of purchases by visitors who had supposedly departed. Her store provided clear sightlines to the Weatherstone property, and she had witnessed late-night movements of large, burlap-wrapped bundles and smoke rising from the smokehouse at odd hours. Her knowledge made her the most dangerous witness and the most vulnerable. The Weatherstones were her best customers, their patronage keeping her business solvent when questioned. Her responses followed the community script with a mechanical precision, but her hands trembled and her eyes never met the investigator's gaze. She had chosen prosperity over principle. The investigation's failure became inevitable. Faced with a solid wall of pleasant, cooperative, and utterly useless testimony, federal authorities abandoned the search by late March. The official report, a work of bureaucratic fiction, attributed the disappearances to misadventure in treacherous mountain terrain. The Weatherstone family was formally commended for their cooperation. Beneath the hollows restored deathly tranquility. A profound change had taken place. The residents' complicity had purchased them a temporary peace at the cost of their souls. And as new arrivals trickled into the region, they brought with them different questions and a stubborn refusal to accept the silence of the mountains as an answer. The bold success of the Weatherstone family, their triumph over federal authority, bred a dangerous confidence. But boldness, when nurtured by unchecked evil, often breeds the very exposure it seeks to prevent. A new figure was walking the path into Black Bear Hollow, carrying not a satchel of legal documents, but a worn Bible and questions that no one wanted to answer when family members, driven by a grief that transcends fear, start demanding justice for the disappeared. Even the most carefully constructed lies begin to crack. The new minister arrived in the spring of 1895. His name was Reverend Samuel Pendleton, the nephew of Cyrus Pendleton, the first documented victim. And unlike the officials before him, he possessed something the Weatherstones couldn't easily eliminate: a stubborn, unyielding faith. Backed by a moral courage that burned with a cold, clear flame. On the morning of April 15th, 1895, the sound of church bells rang across the hollow for the first time in months, a clear, defiant peal against the suffocating silence. Reverend Pendleton had reopened the abandoned chapel. He bore a striking, almost ghostly resemblance to his missing uncle, the same lean build, the same penetrating gray eyes, and the same habit of speaking uncomfortable truths with a gentle, relentless persistence. But where Cyrus had been naive, Samuel arrived armed with knowledge from his own private investigation. The Weatherstone family attended his first service with their characteristic, unnerving politeness, filing into the front pew. Josiah was a somber patriarch, Lavinia a grieving mother of the community. Their children sat like statues throughout the lengthy sermon, which, pointedly, was about moral accountability in isolated communities, in his private journal. Reverend Pendleton wrote Uncle Cyrus wrote 17 letters. The final letter mentions disturbing discoveries and promised revelations. That letter never came. This community is not just harboring a secret, it is slowly being digested by one. Priscilla Redfern, the Hollow's midwife and keeper of its women's secrets, found herself in an impossible position. Her work had given her intimate knowledge of the Weatherstone household. She had delivered several of Lavinia's children and had observed signs of malnutrition impossible for such a prosperous family. More troubling were the pregnancies that ended under mysterious circumstances. Young, unwed women from outside the community who sought the family's help, only to disappear before their babies were born. Priscilla's records, kept in a personal cipher, documented these vanishings. The Weatherstone family always provided plausible explanations, but the pattern was too consistent. When Reverend Pendleton asked about his uncle's medical condition, Priscilla faced a terrible choice. She recalled her examination of Cyrus, remembering signs she had then attributed to adjustment difficulties. Now, Those same symptoms seemed like clear evidence of systematic poisoning. The minister's method of investigation differed from the federal approach. He conducted no formal interviews. Instead, he engaged in casual pastoral conversations, his questions emerging naturally from discussions about Scripture, making them harder to deflect. He slowly began to unburden the residents of their guilt, not by demanding answers, but by offering forgiveness. The pressure intensified when Samuel announced his intention to establish a proper consecrated cemetery. A formal graveyard would require detailed records of all previous burials, including identification of remains and cause of death information that had never been properly documented, a fact on which the Weatherstones had built their empire. Lavinia recognized the existential threat this minister posed. Churches created social structures that competed with the informal power networks she had spent years cultivating. Her response was subtle. She began attending women's prayer circles, monitoring conversations. She increased her charitable activities, reminding recipients of their dependence on Weatherstone generosity. But the minister's most dangerous innovation was private confession. It was here that the wall of silence finally broke. Verity Blackthorne, the general store owner, was the first to crack under the unbearable weight of her shame. During a pastoral visit, she found herself describing, in a torrent of terrified whispers, the strange purchases, the late-night activities she had observed, and the faces of travelers she had served who were never seen again. The confession left both participants trembling, understanding they had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. Samuel now possessed direct eyewitness testimony, and Verity had become a marked woman. That night, smoke rose from the Weatherstone chimney in unusual volumes, and the Hollows dogs, silent for months, began howling with a renewed, frantic intensity. The family had decided their most persistent problem required a permanent solution. The chapel door stood open in the morning wind. Reverend Pendleton's body was nowhere to be found. His blood, dark and viscous, had pooled between the altar stones. His Bible lay open on the pulpit, turned to Ezekiel 34, a passage about shepherds who failed to protect their flocks from wolves. Its pages stained with bloody fingerprints. When communities discover their moral leaders have been eliminated, they must make a final choice: confront the evil, or become its damned accomplices. The dawn of April 22nd, 1895, brought the sound of crows gathering in unnatural numbers. Priscilla Redfern, the midwife, made the discovery. Her scream echoed across the hollow, shattering the morning's false tranquility. The scene inside suggested a struggle followed by a methodical, yet hasty, cleanup. But the Weatherstones' rage had compromised their efficiency. Scattered beneath the pulpit were Samuel Pendleton's final sermon notes. His last entry, penned in what appeared to be his own blood, contained a list of names, a list that matched perfectly with Verity Blackthorne's confession. A final message, tucked inside the Bible's binding, was his last will and testament: if something happens to me, search the Weatherstone property for evidence of systematic murder. They've been feeding this community human flesh for over 20 years. The bones are buried in their root cellar. Dr. Gainsborough's medical examination of the blood evidence confirmed the minister's fate. The volume indicated a mortal throat wound, and chemical analysis detected the same paralytic compounds he had been finding in his patients. The minister had been drugged, tortured, and killed. The physician's official report to county authorities was the first formal accusation of murder against the Weatherstone family by a respected community member. But the Hollows' response was not a cry for justice, but a retreat into the darkness of willful blindness. A memorial service was held where residents spoke of the minister's probable departure. Verity Blackthorne closed a store and vanished. Her inventory, purchased by the Weatherstones at a price well above market value. Acknowledging their neighbors were murderers would require acknowledging their own complicity. Sheriff Abner Claiborne, faced with the undeniable report, was trapped. He understood the political realities. The Weatherstones' influence was vast. His compromise satisfied no one. He announced a formal investigation while privately communicating to the Weatherstones that a voluntary relocation might resolve the situation without a public trial. Josiah, a master strategist, initiated a carefully orchestrated transition. The family's departure was staged as a business opportunity in the mining country of Tennessee. During a farewell gathering filled with fraudulent expressions of regret, they promised to return. By the first week of May, Black Bear Hollow had returned to its surface tranquility. The chapel remained closed, its blood-stained floorboards covered with fresh lumber that couldn't eliminate the persistent smell of copper and fear. The Weatherstone legacy, however, could not be buried as easily as their victims. The autumn of 1895 in Copper Ridge, Tennessee, brought the sound of pickaxes striking coal. The Weatherstone family had chosen their new home with cunning, a remote mining community where strangers arrived daily, and where dangerous conditions made disappearances commonplace. Josiah quickly established trade relationships, becoming the primary meat supplier for the company commissaries within months. The new Weatherstone smokehouse was producing quantities of meat that seemed impossibly abundant. Lavinia, for her part, integrated herself into the local women's circles, her herbal knowledge proving invaluable. But Tennessee mining country operated under different rules. The Hayes Mining Syndicate employed educated supervisors who maintained detailed personnel records. Supervisor Ernest Caldwell noticed discrepancies in work accounts that couldn't be explained by normal attrition. The family's first major mistake was targeting Benjamin Matthews, a geological specialist whose disappearance triggered an investigation by both corporate security and federal inspectors. Corporate detective Samuel Morrison arrived in Copper Ridge with resources that local sheriffs could not match. His investigation quickly revealed inconsistencies the Weatherstones couldn't explain away. Soil samples from their property revealed lime used to accelerate decomposition. Structural analysis of their outbuildings identified hidden chambers. The final reckoning came on March 17th, 1897. The raid, involving federal marshals, corporate security, and Tennessee state authorities, gave the family no opportunity to escape. The evidence was staggering: the physical remains of at least 43 victims. Lavinia's detailed ledgers of death and financial documentation proving the family had been selling human flesh to unsuspecting customers, including the mining company commissary. Josiah Weatherstone died during the arrest, reportedly while resisting officers. Lavinia and 3 of their adult children were transported to Nashville for a trial that would shock the nation. The court proceedings documented systematic cannibalism spanning over 25 years and involving dozens of victims. On December 5th, 1897, Lavinia Apple White Weatherstone was executed by hanging. She maintained her innocence to the end. Her final recorded words a chilling promise that her family's work would continue through bloodlines that extended far beyond official records. By federal order, the Weatherstone property in Copper Ridge was burned to the ground. A similar order was given for their former holdings in Black Bear Hollow. But destroying buildings could not eliminate the psychological contamination. Copper Ridge experienced a mass exodus. Black Bear Hollow was eventually abandoned entirely, its structures slowly consumed by the wilderness, a rotting monument to a community that sold its soul for a taste of poisoned meat. The official investigation concluded with recommendations for improved oversight. Yet, some investigators privately acknowledge the Weatherstone case was likely not an anomaly, but merely the most visible example of a darkness that festered in the remote corners of the nation. Modern researchers have identified unexplained disappearances in at least a dozen other Appalachian communities where individuals bearing Weatherstone family names had resided. The scope suggests not an isolated family of predators, but a potential network. The question, then, is not simply how this one family could commit such atrocities. The more terrifying question is, how many others were there? And in the quiet, forgotten corners of the world, how many are there still local legends persist? A final, enduring warning: beware of visitors whose generosity seems too perfect, whose meat tastes too tender, and whose hospitality conceals an appetite that civilization can neither acknowledge nor ever hope to satisfy.